The morning light over Luzon was thin and metallic, like the sheen of worn aluminum. The war had moved on, but its scent lingered in the tropical air. Burnt oil, rust, and silence. At Clark Air Base, the runways were cratered with months of violence, yet among the ruins stood an aircraft untouched by time. A Mitsubishi G4M, tail number 763-12. Major Frank T. McCoy of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, approached it with the slow caution of a man meeting something both precious and dangerous. He had examined wrecks before, twisted fuselages, burned skeletons of engines, but this one was whole. Its pale green paint had dulled to gray. The red Hinomaru circles on its wings were faded, half sandblasted away by the monsoon winds. To McCoy, the bomber was a riddle. It looked purposeful, aerodynamic, sleek, yet something about it felt wrong. He circled the nose, noting the narrow frame, the lack of armor plating around the cockpit. Through the glass canopy, sunlight caught the edges of empty instrument dials. The interior smelled faintly of fuel, a ghost of missions flown and lost. He knelt, brushed away mud from a small inspection panel, and unscrewed it. Inside, instead of the self-sealing fuel system he expected, he found only bare aluminum, thin walls, no rubber compound, no protection at all. He checked again, thinking perhaps he had opened the wrong bay. Then he crawled under the wing and tapped the tank with his knuckles. It rang like a kettle. Thousands of liters of high-octane fuel had once been held behind that paper-thin skin. In combat, one tracer round would have turned it into an inferno. McCoy stood in the humid air, staring at the sky as if searching for an answer. This was not an oversight, he realized. It was deliberate. Somewhere in Tokyo, a group of engineers had looked at the same diagrams and chosen range over survival. The Betty, Mitsubishi's G4M, was built to go farther than any bomber of its class in 1941, but the cost of that range was fire. The paradox haunted him. For years, Allied pilots had watched these bombers ignite in midair with a single burst from a .5 caliber gun. They called them flying lighters, one-shot Zippoms. Yet, before the skies turned against them, these same planes had carried Japan's empire across half the Pacific. How could brilliance and tragedy coexist so completely in one machine? That question became the thread McCoy followed as his men photographed, measured, and documented every rivet of the captured aircraft. They were not just studying metal. They were dissecting a belief. The story of the Betty began long before it burned. In the 1930s, as the world staggered through depression and uncertainty, Japan's leaders believed destiny required distance. Their empire was an archipelago without the resources to sustain its ambitions. Oil lay beyond the seas in the Dutch East Indies. Rubber, tin, iron, all beyond reach. To secure them, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded weapons that could strike across oceans, independent of bases, independent of refueling. When the Navy issued its request for a new land-based bomber, the specification read almost like fantasy. It had to fly more than 3,000 miles, carry a ton of bombs, and cruise at the speed of contemporary fighters. Armor could be ignored. Defensive guns could be minimal. Mitsubishi's engineers accepted the challenge. Chief designer Kiro Honjo envisioned a long, smooth fuselage, cylindrical, efficient, almost fragile. He used the lightest possible structure, 2 radial engines and vast fuel tanks occupying nearly every space between spars. To save weight, they omitted armor. They omitted self-sealing rubber. Even the landing gear was simplified. By 1941, the prototype, codenamed Betty by Allied intelligence, had achieved what no other twin-engine bomber could. It could fly from Formosa to Manila, strike, and return without refueling. In range and speed, it eclipsed the British Blenheim, the German HE-111, and even early models of the American B-25. To the Japanese Navy, it seemed the perfect weapon for a short, decisive war. When war came, the Betty performed exactly as promised. On December 8, 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor, 82 G4Ms lifted from airfields in Formosa. They droned south toward Luzon, formation after formation gleaming in the morning sun. The Americans at Clark Field were still scrambling to organize their B-17s when the Bettys arrived. Within 45 minutes, the air power of the U.S. Far East Air Force was wrecked. Hangars burned, bombers lay gutted. For the Japanese crews, it was a triumph. The aircraft had flown nearly 500 miles, struck, and returned unscathed. The doctrine of range had been vindicated. 2 days later, the Betty reached its zenith. Off the coast of Malaya, the Royal Navy's Force Z, led by the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse, steamed to intercept the invasion fleet. They had no air cover. At midday, Japanese torpedo bombers descended in waves, Bettys among them. The sea erupted with white plumes and smoke. Within 90 minutes, both great ships rolled and sank. It was the first time in history that capital ships maneuvering at sea were destroyed solely by aircraft. In Tokyo, newspapers exulted. To the admirals, the Betty had proven the future belonged to the air. Its extraordinary reach had turned geography into a weapon. Yet even in victory, the cost was hidden. Those same fuel tanks that gave it power also made it a death trap. By 1942, as Allied fighters grew stronger and radar closed the skies, the Betty's invulnerability vanished. American pilots learned that a single burst could set an entire formation ablaze. The Bettys would continue straight, trailing fire until the aluminum skin tore apart. The myth of invincibility met the arithmetic of attrition. In August 1942, over Guadalcanal, 23 G4Ms attacked U.S. ships near Savo Island. 18 were shot down. 120 airmen died in minutes. From that day, the name Flying Cigar became literal, a shape designed for speed, consumed by flame. Faith cannot armor steel. The Americans understood that lesson differently. They added weight, thickness, redundancy. A B-17 that limped home on 3 engines proved more valuable than one that burned brilliantly and was gone. The U.S. could afford protection because it could afford production. Abundance, not ideology, would decide the war. At Clark Field in 1945, McCoy's discovery of those naked fuel tanks confirmed what pilots had already known by sight and smell. The Betty was a masterpiece that killed its own crews. He photographed everything: the rivet lines, the empty compartments, the scarred but unbroken fuselage. Then he dictated a report describing the paradox, a design born from genius and doomed by it. But the story did not end in that hangar. The Betty's journey carried it through every stage of Japan's war, from triumph to annihilation. As 1943 began, the bomber's range made it a natural courier for high-ranking officers.
One such flight would change the course of history, the mission of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese naval transmission detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The architect of Pearl Harbor would be flying in a Betty, escorted by fighters. The U.S. Army Air Forces planned a long-range interception, Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38 Lightnings lifted from Guadalcanal, flying hundreds of miles over open sea. They arrived at the exact moment Yamamoto's formation approached Bougainville. The lead Betty dove into the jungle, another spiraled into the sea. When Japanese search teams found the wreckage, Yamamoto's body was still strapped in his seat, 2 bullet wounds through his chest.
When Yamamoto's Betty burned in the jungle of Bougainville, it marked more than the death of a man. It signaled the beginning of Japan's long unraveling. The empire had reached its farthest tide. What had once seemed boundless, range, initiative, momentum, now began to contract. The Allies advanced by island and by industry. American factories poured out aircraft faster than the front could absorb them. The Pacific filled with the hum of machines built not for elegance, but for endurance. In that mechanical tide, the Betty became a relic, an artifact of a war Japan could no longer afford to fight. Yet they continued to fly her. In 1944, as Japan's perimeter collapsed, G4M bombers became transports, torpedo carriers, anything that could still move. Some ferried troops across the shrinking empire. Others carried dignitaries or secret cargoes under cover of darkness. Every flight was a gamble. When enemy fighters appeared, the unarmored fuselages offered no defense. Pilots described watching tracer rounds rip through the wings, watching fuel vapor ignite into white fire. Once aflame, the Betty gave its crew less than 20 seconds. The aircraft did not explode, it dissolved, melting in mid-air. Survivors were rare. Still, the logic that had created her persisted. To the Japanese High Command, sacrifice was proof of devotion. To die fulfilling the mission was considered the highest honor. If the aircraft's design demanded death, so be it. By early 1945, that fatal logic took physical form. Engineers fitted Bettys with a new weapon, a small rocket-powered suicide glider called the Oka, or cherry blossom. Each Betty would carry an Oka slung beneath its belly, ferrying it within range of American ships. The Oka pilot, once released, would ignite his rocket and dive straight into the target. It was a desperate invention, one fragile plane delivering another. On March 21, 1945, 18 Betty bombers of the 721st Kokutai rose from Kanoya Air Base, each bearing an Oka. They climbed into heavy overcast, escorted by fighters that could do little to protect them. Off Okinawa, American radar picked them up. Hellcats from Task Force 58 dove in. One by one, the Bettys vanished in fire before their pilots even saw the sea. Not a single Oka reached release range. It was slaughter on an industrial scale. Technology turned inward, consuming its makers. In the months that followed, Japan's air arm decayed into fragments. Factories bombed, fuel gone, training hours cut to nothing. The once feared Betty lingered only as a symbol, a weapon that had outlived its war. Some tried to correct her flaws. In late 1944, the Model 3 appeared, finally equipped with self-sealing tanks and limited armor. But the additions reduced her range by nearly 2,000 kilometers. In trying to make her survive, they erased the very qualities she had been built to embody. It was too late anyway. Over Japan's burning cities, the skies belonged to the B-29, vast, pressurized, and indifferent. Against that flying fortress, the Betty was a museum piece. By summer, the Imperial Navy had ceased to exist. The remnants of its air service waited in hangars, grounded by fuel shortages. Crews slept beside their aircraft, unsure whether the next order would send them on a mission or into oblivion. Then came Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, and silence. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice, unheard by his people until that day, announced the unthinkable: surrender. Across the islands and the seas, men who had been prepared to die now faced the strange task of living. 4 days later, a new order was issued. 2 Betty bombers would be painted white, with green crosses along their fuselages. Their mission was not to attack, but to carry Japan's surrender delegation to the Allied base at Iishima, off Okinawa. The aircraft received the call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2. Mechanics removed all armament. Pilots replaced their flight jackets with white shirts. In the heat of August 19, 1945, they taxied onto the runway, the same design that had carried destruction, now repurposed for peace. Waiting to meet them were American fighters, P-38 Lightnings of the 49th Fighter Group, 9th Squadron. Among their pilots was Lieutenant Howard Oglesby, a veteran of New Guinea, Leyte, and Okinawa. The Americans flew tight escort, their guns silent, watching as the white Bettys glided toward Iishima's strip. They landed smoothly, the sound of their engines fading into the tropical air. Photographs from that morning show the Japanese crews standing beside their planes, heads bowed, the green crosses bright against the white paint. In that image, the circle of the war closed. The same aircraft that had ignited the Pacific conflict by torching Clark Field now delivered its nation's surrender. For Major McCoy, reviewing his technical reports in Manila, the symbolism was unmistakable. He had begun by studying an enemy machine, but what he uncovered was a philosophy, a worldview built into rivets and fuel lines. The Betty was not a mistake. It was a mirror. It reflected a culture that valued range over return, mission over man. In its elegant simplicity lay an assumption that victory would be swift, that courage could replace protection, and that the enemy would not endure. But wars are not fought on belief alone. They are fought in physics, logistics, and time. When Japan's war stretched beyond its first year, the arithmetic of endurance favored the side that could build and rebuild, the side that armored its crews not with faith, but with rubber and steel. The Americans had learned to measure survival. Each pilot who returned brought experience, trained replacements, improved tactics. Every bomber that limped home with holes in its wings was a lesson written in metal. The Japanese learned something different, that perfection of design can become a prison. The Betty's smooth skin, her long wings, her unbroken fuselage, each was a monument to purity of purpose. But purity is fragile. The first burst of flame unmade it. When American engineers at Clark Air Base cut open the captured bomber's wings, they found beauty and terror interlaced. The tanks were welded like sculpture, precise and efficient, but one tracer round would have turned them into fountains of fire. They ran calculations, comparing the Betty's structure with Allied bombers. A B-24 carried twice the weight, with armor, self-sealing tanks, redundant systems. Yet it could still match the Betty's range once auxiliary tanks were added. America's abundance had out-engineered Japan's daring. The findings circulated through the Air Technical Intelligence reports in early 1945. McCoy's name appeared in footnotes, but the real message was silent. Doctrine decides survival. By war's end, Japan's skies were littered with wreckage that told the same story. Zero fighters, once invincible, had burned for lack of armor. Dive bombers, transports, trainers, all built from the same creed of reach before resilience. In the ruins of Mitsubishi's factories, workers salvaged scraps of aluminum, now twisted and charred. The line that had built the Betty ended in ash. When peace came, some of those engineers returned to build civilian airliners. Others never spoke of their wartime designs. In interviews decades later, one designer reflected quietly, "We made her perfect for the first year of the war. We forgot there would be a second." Perfection within a flawed premise is still failure. The Betty's legacy lived on, not as a triumph of engineering, but as a caution. In flight manuals and design schools, her diagrams appeared beside notes on self-sealing tanks, an example of how brilliance can blind its own creators. In museums today, only fragments remain. A wing here, a cockpit frame, a rusted engine nacelle. The rest lies beneath the seas she once crossed.